This video focuses on Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl. Just some context for where we are at this point in the semester. As we come to a close in the United States, the literature is greatly impacted by the Civil War. It is in this period, too, that we see the transition in American literature from Romanticism into realism. In England, we're going to see, too, that this is a period here in the 1860s, 1870s, where England, where Great Britain is becoming an imperial power, and its power throughout the world is greatly magnified. The issue of slavery is one coming to the forefront here in the United States in the 1860s. The Atlantic slave trade began in the 1440s by the Portuguese. By the mid-1700s, European powers, including England and Holland and France, had become world economic powers because of slavery and the triangle trade. By the early 1800s, the African slave trade had been abolished by Great Britain and the United States, but notice it's the slave trade. It is not the abolition of slavery. In 1838, Great Britain does abolish slavery in all its colonies, but obviously in the United States, slavery remains until the end of the Civil War. We see a shift, though, in power structures from slavery into the colonization, though, of Africa in this time period, too, as Great Britain expands its imperial power. The reading for today is by Harriet Jacobs. Her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is her story of living in slavery and her escape to freedom in the North. She wrote under the name of Linda Brunt in order to protect her family that was still living in the South. She wrote this book in the 1850s, but it wasn't published until 1861. And this is a book that is known for being a bit different from other slave narratives by women, because, and by men too, because she deals more frankly with the sexual abuse of women in slavery. She hid in her grandmother's attic space for 7 years. We see this in the section entitled The Loophole of Retreat. This is an image from a theatrical production that tells the story of Harriet Jacobs' life. But can you imagine being in this space for 7 years? It was 9 feet long and 7 feet wide. The highest part was 3 feet high and sloped down abruptly to the loose board floor. So she had to stay in this space to remain hidden so that her slave master, Dr. Flint, would not find her. And this is the story that is described in Incidents, but it is what Harriet Jacobs endured herself. She tells us, too, over on page 935 that, by this point she has 2 young children. Her grandmother's house is where she is hiding herself away. She had 2 small children at the time, but the only way that she could even see these children, because they did not know that she was there, if they had known that she was there, then that would have endangered them and her. But the only way that she could see them was by drilling some small holes within the roof in order to look down on them. But can you imagine being in that situation for 7 years? Slave narratives in general, some descriptors of what they are. They are autobiographical. They tell the very standard pattern is that the person who has escaped slavery tells the story of their life generally from their very earliest years to the time of their freedom. Harriet Jacobs does tell us a bit about her life in the North after she escapes slavery in the South, but typically the ending point is freedom itself. A slave narrative gives a voice to and empowers the writer of the slave narrative, obviously through the words themselves. Sometimes the author is hidden. For example, here Harriet Jacobs goes by the name Linda Brunt in order to protect her family. Slave narratives were written for persuasive purposes, most obviously to persuade people that they needed to do something about ending slavery. Here, her readership would have been, in large part, Northerners who could impact either the political system or, since this is 1861 too, as well, 1861 also, this is at the beginning of the Civil War, so it could be too that the book persuades people to go to war, to put their money toward the war effort too. Narratives by women typically focus on the freedom to raise their own families. In slavery, very often families were separated, mothers were not able to raise their own children. So narratives by women typically focus on that freedom. Narratives by men tend to focus more on individual freedom and the freedom to receive an education. Oftentimes, too, the title page uses the phrase in her own words or his own words to authenticate, to say this is the reality of what happens in slavery, told by a person who has endured it. We see in this narrative, too, the way she describes rights of slaves being stripped away from them, slaves not having the right to names passed down in their own families to them, but a slave master gives the slave a name. There are not rights to family ties. We see reference to this over on page 925. The slave master would have made the decision even about a marriage partner of a slave woman. The husband of a slave has no power to protect her, to protect his wife, she says. The slave has no right to any family ties of their own. She is not able to marry the man that she loves, who is a free man. She decides she does not want to pull him into a situation, too, where he cannot be free. She tells us, too, over on page 933, at the birth of her daughter, that slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women, and that is because of the sexual abuse of women in slavery. The book is about Linda Brunt writing herself into being by telling her story. She is greatly impacted by the role of her grandmother, who is a businesswoman, who is an important role model for her. Her grandmother, too, seeks to gain freedom for her family members. And it is her grandmother who's referred to at the end of the selections that you have here, the chapters that you have here, too, who has been a figure who watches over her throughout this entire ordeal. Linda Brent, too, is not a, a usual woman character of the 19th century. For example, we saw Fainting Women with Austen. Also, you might not know these texts, but I think I've mentioned them before. We see in the 19th century, too, some cases, too, of women closeted away up in attic spaces who are labeled as deranged. For example, I know some of you have probably read Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, or perhaps Jane Eyre, in which the wife is closeted away up in the attic and ultimately dies. This figure, I guess essentially these are female characters who do not have power. We see, though, in Linda Brent, a woman who has power, a woman, too, who asserts her choice over who is going to father her children. She becomes involved with Mr. Sands, a white man in the community, and fathers 2 children by him. We see, too, the impact in incidents of what Braxton refers to in this article called Outraged Mother and Articulate Heroine, an example of a woman, actually women if you include Linda, and her grandmother, of using the weapon of language to fight back. Think about it too. Dr. Flint asserts physical control over her, physical abuse of her. Her way of fighting back is through language. Here in this passage, Linda and her grandmother use language as a weapon, dueling with Dr. Flint, gaining psychological space and strength. Linda employs verbal warfare and defensive verbal postures as tools of liberation. Quick thinking and invective play vital roles, and Linda becomes a veritable trickster. Whenever Linda is under sexual attack, she uses sass as a weapon of self-defense. She returns a portion of the poison the master has offered her. Sass preserves the slave girl's self-esteem and increases the psychological distance between herself and the master. A couple of things I want to point out. Oftentimes, particularly in like folk stories, connected to or by African Americans of this time period too. There's a trickster character who attempts to gain control over those who are holding power over them. So this is within an African American tradition of storytelling. Also, this passage points to the use of sass, that is, language as a way to fight back. You see examples of that, and this slide though points more generally to ways she fights back, but she uses sass over on the top of page 926. She is brought in to see Dr. Flint. He is very upset that she loves an African American man. And she replies to him several paragraphs down from the top of the page. I replied, if he is a puppy, I am a puppy, for we are both of the Negro race. It is right and honorable for us to love each other. The man you call a puppy never insulted me, sir, and he would not love me if he did not believe me to be a virtuous woman. He sprang upon me like a tiger and gave me a stunning blow. Dr. Flint asserts physical abuse over her, but she stands tall with dignity, saying that, speaking very calmly, these words. She says, too, she directly addresses her audience who would be reading her narrative. And a couple of these passages, if you'll flip first over to page 926, for example. And I'm going to cut here because I need to stop to make part 2.